Today's conversation is all about processed foods. I'll be chatting with Erin, also known as Food Science Babe, about why processed need not be a dirty word. These days, we often hear that the best way to make healthy choices is to look for foods that are whole or natural and contain ingredients that you can pronounce. It turns out that we can't paint all processed foods with the same villainous brush. In fact, black and white food mantras like whole is always best, processed is always bad, are not only unfounded, but come with costs that we may not recognize. To be clear, neither of us is trying to persuade you to eat chips instead of veggies. We simply want to help you bring more nuance to how you view and how you navigate both processed foods and whole foods. Food Science Babe has worked in the food industry for over 10 years in both the conventional and organic sectors as an engineer and food scientist. Food Science Babe started her social media platform to spare others from falling prey to false information about food and the food industry, beliefs that she once held herself. In addition to being a stay-at-home mom to her adorable 5-year-old daughter with special needs, Erin consults for small food companies in product development, nutrition panel creation, and regulatory guidance. Let's dig in. Welcome to Get Real Health. I'm your host, Dr. Chana Davis. This show cuts through the noise to give you science-based insights from real experts so that you can make smart, healthy choices. Hello, Erin. Welcome to the show. Thank you so much for taking the time to chat today.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
What I want to talk about right now is processed foods and why processed is not necessarily a dirty word. So until recently, I would have been someone who sort of parrots the message that a lot of us hear, which is that the best way to make healthy choices is to only eat whole foods, to look for one ingredient, to look for ingredients you can pronounce, and to view processed foods as universally a bad thing that we should all avoid and are bad for you, full stop.
Yep.
So until recently, I would have probably held that perspective, and I do actually think there's some merit. So there's some kernel of truth behind that I want to make sure we acknowledge. But for me, I started to develop a more nuanced perspective on processed foods because of the plant-based innovations. So
Yep.
I did my PhD with Pat Brown, who founded Impossible Foods. And so he created the Impossible Burger, using plant-based ingredients to mimic the taste and texture and nutritional benefits of beef. And I saw people pushing back against that, using as their logic the fact that, well, it's more than one ingredient and it has ingredients I can't pronounce and it was made in a lab, therefore it must be bad for you and therefore beef must be better. And so anyways, for me, that's what caused me to think, wait a second, this rule has a lot of limitations. And so what I'm hoping to do today is to just have a more nuanced discussion about processed foods. And I'm assuming that's kind of where you're coming from. The part that I've really appreciated from your page that I want to make sure we sort of emphasize is, so you said the costs of over applying these rules. If you can have a good relationship with food and eat only whole foods and not feel restricted, and that's great. Mm-hmm. But that it's a misconception to believe, like when I think about a beef burger versus an Impossible Burger, that the way they're made is the main factor that's relevant as you determine the healthiness of them. To me, like we reiterate, mm-hmm. It's the nutritional profile that matters. So why is it that in general we do see a relationship between processed food intake and poor health outcomes and obesity? And from what I've read, that really speaks to the fact, sort of a subset of processed foods, that many, specifically ultra-processed foods, have lots of added sugar, they have lots of added salt, they have these characteristics that make them sort of hyper-palatable, that make us want to eat more than we necessarily need. They encourage eating outside of food occasions, non-hunger related eating, and all of that kind of contributes to overconsumption period, and overconsumption of certain ingredients. But that doesn't mean that every processed food fits that profile. I mean, some of them do, and some of them don't. Mm-hmm. That's kind of how
Right. Yeah, and I think it's just understanding that they can be a part of a healthy diet. Now, that doesn't mean that, I think a lot of times people think I'm advocating for a 100% ultra-processed diet, and just advocating for understanding and not being afraid of specific ingredients and specific foods is really, my goal in my page. I'm not saying that everyone should be eating a diet with, a majority of ultra processed foods or anything like that, but they can fit into an overall healthy diet. Like if you don't want to consume them, you don't have to. But I think the issue really is not whether, a lot of the misinformation comes from people that don't consume them, which is fine. Hey, if that works for you, and like you said, you don't have a disordered relationship with food, that's fine. But I think they kind of turn that into like, my diet is superior, and this is why, it sort of turns into, I avoid these ingredients because they're toxic. And then all of a sudden, all of this misinformation comes along with that food choice that isn't true. And, it can be harmful for, I'll just give an example. It's more the pesticide side of things, but lists that come up like the Dirty Dozen, those can cause consumers to not buy any produce at all because they're afraid of pesticide residues. And so consumers that might not be able to pay a little bit more for organic foods, or even misinformation said around canned foods and frozen foods, they might just not buy any produce at all because they can't afford fresh produce, or it's just not they don't have it available at their store. And so these rules can be harmful as well, because people can end up being afraid of healthy foods that they should be eating because of these rules, and it can be detrimental to populations that might not have access to whole, fresh foods. But that doesn't mean that you can't still have a healthy diet. I mean, you can get rice and beans, and like I said, frozen canned foods and things like that. And when you start only, when the narrative is sort of like, oh, you can't eat healthy unless you eat fresh whole foods, that sort of, it's not evidence-based, and it also can be harmful for those that don't have access to fresh whole food.
Yeah. I also think it's just a misleading, algorithm for making personal choices. Like there are examples on both sides. For example, like coconut oil, it's one ingredient, it's all natural, yada, yada, but it's also very high in saturated fat, and it's probably going to raise your LDL cholesterol. So if you start slathering everything in coconut oil, I'm sorry, but that's not a health plus.
Right. Right.
And on the other side, and I think of a food like infant formula, I've actually written a lot about the realities of the differences between breast and infant formula, which are much more subtle than people might expect. There shouldn't be shame and guilt associated with feeding your child infant formula. It is not a toxic food, but it's ultra processed.
Right.
And I think to me it comes back to what was the intent of the food processing? Because food scientists can create whatever foods the customers need or want. And so if you want a highly nutritious processed food, then you can create one, like a medical diet, for example, right?
Yep.
And I think, but what we see out there for processed foods reflects, consumer desire for hyper palatable snack foods and so on, but it doesn't mean it's not possible to create a healthy ultra processed
food.
Food.
Yeah, I mean that's the thing too. Like a lot of processed foods, they're just they are allowing even whole fruits and vegetables to last longer, or some of those greens that you'll see in specific packages. I mean that's allowing it to last longer, so it's not being thrown away. And so I think a lot of times too, it's like we think of processed foods as only like the cookies and the chips and like all these other things, but like you said, there can be what you would consider to be ultra processed foods that they have a place. One that I'm just thinking of right now is they're those little puffs for when
the toddler ones?
When kids are transitioning sort of from like purees to solid foods, and somebody had posted something about how these puffs were toxic. They weren't real food. It's basically just I don't know if it's oat or rice, but one of those, and it's essentially just puffed, and then there's maybe a little bit of flavor and like a very, very tiny bit of sugar. But, you know, they were fear mongering over this puff, like, if you feed these to your kids, you're poisoning them, whatever. And it just really irked me because, you know, specifically my daughter, she has cerebral palsy. And so that food for us was like, it was amazing because we weren't really ever sure if she was going to be able to eat solid foods on her own. There was a time where we thought she might have to need a feeding tube. And so when we were trying to transition to solid foods, that was like the one food that she was able to pick up, and she was able to eat it safely because it dissolved. So we weren't worried about her choking on it. But it just makes me mad because there are different situations, and I shouldn't feel like I'm poisoning my child. And obviously I know better, but you know, there's parents out there that don't know better. And then they might think like, oh my gosh, am I poisoning my child? And it's just like, and it also doesn't mean that that's the only thing that she's getting too. So I think there's sort of this black and white thinking that like, if you're feeding your kid that, they don't have a healthy diet overall. But it's like, that can be a very small part of an overall healthy diet. Just because she was eating some of these puffs every day, it doesn't mean that like that was the only thing she was eating. And so I think it's just the black and white thinking of like, if you give your kid this food, you're poisoning them and they have an unhealthy diet. And it's like, that food in and of itself, like that one food you're adding to their diet isn't just all of a sudden making it unhealthy or making it toxic or something like that. And a lot of times that's what that marketing or that misinformation might make a parent feel like. And it's like, you know, like I said, it can be harmful because that was a food that allowed my daughter to be able to transition from purees to solid foods. So, you know, there's a time and a place for a lot of it.
I was hoping we could go through some of the common myths and ingredients that incite fears, and you can, you know, address those head on.
A lot of times things like preservatives just get a really bad rap, and, you know, those are considered to some people to be additives that are unnecessary. But in reality, I mean, preservatives are making foods safer. They're making foods able to last longer. So the two biggest things that you need to control when you're creating a shelf-stable product, or just something even that's refrigerated that you want to last longer, you have to control for pH and water activity. And so the three biggest, I guess you could say, categories of preservatives that you'll see are either salts, which are controlling water activity. You'll see acids, which is controlling pH, and then you'll see on things that are high in oil content or even just oils themselves, you'll see antioxidants in there. And so, you know, a lot of times these ingredients you might not understand what they are. They might have names that you don't recognize, that you can't pronounce, that you've maybe heard something about where somebody calls it toxic. You know, a lot of these ingredients do have bad reputations just because people don't really understand what they are. But like I said, they are allowing food to stay safer for longer, not, you know, grow harmful bacteria or microorganisms. You know, as far as oils go, they help to keep them from going rancid, so they can stand the shelf longer. And so these things aren't making foods, you know, they're certainly not making foods less safe. In a lot of cases, they're making foods more safe. Like I said, they can reduce food waste. And I mean, even things, people might see something like ascorbic acid on the label and think, oh, that must be bad because I'm not really sure what that is. I mean, it's vitamin C, and these things, even vitamins can be used as preservatives. So vitamin E is used as an antioxidant in oils. And so I think a lot of these ingredients that you might see sort of at the end of the ingredient deck are typically the ones that people kind of look at and they're like, oh, I'm not really sure. I'm not really sure if I should be eating this. And first of all, they're in there at super, super low amounts typically. I mean, they're at the end of the ingredient deck, and they are in there for a good reason. They're keeping it safer. But I just think there's this fear around very specific ingredients. And, you know, sometimes somebody will send me something on, I don't know, something like carrageenan. And it's like, I'll have to even just look at like, why are people all of a sudden scared of this? And you'll typically look into it and it's just something just crazy, like, a study that they found where it was, given to rats at super high doses and stuff like that. And it's just like, that's not applicable to the amounts that they're used in foods. And the other thing too is that foods are, they are regulated. These additives are regulated. And so I think a lot of people also just think like we can just put whatever we want into foods at whatever amounts we want and there's no regulations around it. But that's not true. I mean, especially these additives that are being put in there, they are specifically approved, and a lot of them are approved at very specific amounts in different applications, based on toxicology data. And so the amounts that are actually ending up in the foods are, incredibly low, way lower than any amount that would be harmful or anything like that. So I really don't think there's any, specific ingredients that people necessarily need to avoid.
As I was kind of thinking through just how my own thinking has evolved on this and the information that's helped me to achieve more clarity, I think there are two aspects to it. One is a recognition of certain scientific principles, like the dose makes the poison, and that when we think about toxicity, that it doesn't really, that knowing whether something came from a lab or what came from nature is not really what matters. What matters is how high the dose is relative to the dose that's harmful to us. So I think that's kind of how I've started to think about like the scientific piece, and that's that sort of a foundational piece of knowledge. The second foundational piece of knowledge that you alluded to is this sort of species difference. First of all, the dose with the rat experiments that's an issue both of species and of dose. But we can't just test everything in humans. So as much as I don't like animal testing, gratuitous animal testing, we need to find some way to test things before humans. So the dose consideration being a huge one, and that so often we see animal studies blown out of proportion that we're using, egregious doses. A second thing is just sort of species specific differences, which we'll maybe talk about later when we get into pesticides, is that, something that's harmful to a plant is some compounds have very specific mechanisms of action, like might be antimicrobial, but that doesn't necessarily mean anything for me. I mean, it might for my gut microflora and so on, but we have to be careful about extrapolating in general whenever we extrapolate from animals to humans.
The dose makes,
are there anything else on the scientific foundations? Is there anything else that you would maybe add in there that really helps you frame the whole way you think about food ingredients?
Yeah, I think the biggest things are just those, core concepts of chemistry and toxicology. Just, I think just understanding the dose makes the poison, that applies to all chemicals, whether they are natural or synthetic. So a lot of these arbitrary food rules and kind of mantras and stuff like that, like they just always seem to come back to the appeal to nature fallacy, where people just assume that if it's natural, it's safer. But we have to, I even find it's tough to not think that way. But you just, whether something is, some of the most toxic chemicals that we know of are naturally occurring. So even when it comes to colors and flavors in foods too, there's marketing on packages now that specifically says like no synthetic colors or flavors, and people assume that the natural ones are safer or better, and they're not. The synthetic ones sometimes are even tested to an even more extent, and so we actually have more data on some of these synthetic ingredients a lot of times. And so I think just understanding that whether a chemical is natural or synthetic, just saying, so much of the food marketing out there is just literally stating that something is natural, and then people just assume it's better or it's safer or it's healthier. But we have to understand that natural doesn't really tell you anything helpful about the toxicity or the safety of a given chemical. And like you said too, those rodent studies, they are used to figure out toxic doses so that we can set the levels in foods at, the doses that we set them at. But what happens is people that really don't understand what those studies are being used for is they take those and they're like, oh my gosh, look what happened to these rats. Like, this is horrible for us, not understanding that the dose makes the poison and they're in foods at way lower doses. So, I think just understanding just understanding some pretty fundamental concepts, I think is helpful to kind of cut through a lot of the marketing and just sort of a lot of the myths that you see out there.
Yeah, I mean, it's helpful, like, again, coming back to the animal experiments, the way my understanding, having not worked in the food industry, is that they basically escalate the doses as high as it takes to see something bad happen. And then they want to know what level did it take for something bad to happen. And then they regulate it at, thousands of fold lower than that. So we are going to make sure we're nowhere close. After adjusting for species specific factors, they then regulate to give us a huge buffer between how much we might get.
Yep, that's exactly how it works. So they figure out basically the no adverse effects level, and then they essentially set it so that what ends up happening is that the food itself is basically more toxic than these additives in there. Like, you would have to eat a toxic amount of food before reaching like a toxic level of any of these additives. So yeah,
I remember seeing something about like glyphosate and Cheerios or whatever, and this pesticides is a different story, but you'd have to eat 20 boxes a day or something. I mean, okay, well, you've got bigger problems if you're eating 20 boxes a day.
Right. A child would have to eat like over 600 servings a day, and it's like, obviously the food is you're going to have issues from the actual food itself before the pesticides.
I would love to help people shift their thinking away from concerns about toxins and more towards, is my child meeting all of their nutritional needs? And am I taking care not to overdo it on some of the common things we overdo, like, sugar sweetened beverages, excess salt, excess sugar? We don't want to overdo those things, but you can still incorporate some processed foods and not overdo it.
Right. Yep.
We're kind of all over the place here, but bringing it back to something earlier, when I wanted to make sure we're giving a balanced perspective on that there are some, obviously, that whole foods have a lot of merit, and that this is not a completely baseless rule of thumb, but it is just a rule of thumb with limitations to apply more judiciously and not as in a black and white way. The other thing I wanted to recognize in terms of just coming back to additives is that, or I think a good example here is actually artificial sweeteners, is sort of the personal element of, there's what's toxic and then there's like what agrees with you. So a lot of like sugar alcohols might cause gas and bloating, for example. Does that mean it's toxic? That's not the same thing. That's saying it doesn't really agree with me. So some people might find I feel better when I remove these things from my diet, but it doesn't necessarily equate with toxicity and poisoning,
Right. Yeah, and there are like, some completely natural foods too that somebody might eat and it might not agree with them, and
lactose.
That doesn't obviously exactly. That doesn't mean that it's toxic. If it doesn't agree with you, then don't eat it. But like the artificial sweeteners, a lot of times people will say those are toxic and they shouldn't be consumed, and once again, they are regulated, they are safe at the amounts that we consume them. And for some people that want to have, people that have diabetes and they want to have something sweet every once in a while, like, it can be something that could be a good choice for them. And once again, I think that's where the sort of shaming part comes into, or just scaring consumers, like, that have been eating artificial, sweeteners in a few things, and all of a sudden they see misinformation about it, and it's like, am I poisoning myself? And like you said, I mean, like, something being toxic versus it not agreeing with you is, those aren't the same thing. Like, inulin is one too that doesn't agree with me at all. So it's a fiber that we put into things like Fiber One bars, and so it's a naturally derived ingredient, but I cannot eat anything with inulin in it. Does that mean that it's toxic? No, it doesn't mean it's toxic, but just doesn't agree with me. So yeah.
I think all of the, I'd say pretty much all of the pitfalls of navigating choices of processed foods, you can maybe apply the same rules of thumb to non-processed foods is don't overdo it on one thing. Be mindful of your own personal reaction to it. Pay attention to the actual nutritional profile of it, not just its origins. Look for more fiber, look for less sugar, look for less salt. It's all the same rules. Both of these are very diverse categories, I suppose, is the bottom line message I'm hoping to convey to people.
Yeah, and I think a good example too is just added sugars. So like you said, pay attention to the actual nutritional value, not necessarily the origin. And I did an article and I made like a graphic of all the different added sugars and just sort of showing like a lot of people think if maple syrup or honey or agave syrup is on a label that it's healthier than if sugar was used. But in reality, I mean, these things, they all have 4 calories per gram. They're pretty much the same ratio of fructose to glucose. And there's really, your body is really not able to know the difference, even high fructose corn syrup, which obviously people, there's a very bad reputation with that. But it's so interesting because they are metabolized by your body very similarly, regular table sugar versus honey versus high fructose corn syrup. And so, it is more about the actual nutritional value of something versus the origin of it.
Yeah. I think that now that there's this added sugar label in the US, I think that honey and so on and maple syrup didn't get a pass. Am I right?
No, so those will be added sugars. So those are all going to be considered added sugars. Even something like, a lot of like fruit snacks, they'll say like made with real fruit, but a lot of them use fruit concentrates. And so whatever the difference is between a 100% juice and the concentrate, those added sugars will have to be labeled as added sugars, even if they're coming from a fruit juice. So, so that will be a good way to see, if you're not familiar with the types of added sugars, on the ingredient deck, there will be a specific line now for added sugars. So,
I'm glad to see that that happening.
Yeah, I think it'll be helpful and hopefully less confusing than, I think a lot of people used to just look for sugar on the label and they were like, oh, if there's no sugar, then there's no added sugar, but it'll, now it'll be easier to see that there is. So,
Well, we ended up taking more time than I had planned to, so I feel like we should probably bring this to a close. Is there anything that sort of parting words to leave people with in terms of how to navigate their food choices with, facts, not fear, especially when it comes to looking at ingredient lists?
Yeah, I think just don't pay attention to those very simplified rules that you might see. Just keep in mind those fundamental concepts that the dose makes the poison applies to all chemicals, and that, whether it's natural or synthetic doesn't really tell you anything helpful. So I think just some very basic concepts can kind of help you to kind of see through a lot of those, silly things that you'll see or myths that you see perpetuated, specifically mostly on social media.
Well, thank you very much for your time. It's been a pleasure chatting with you. Oh, sorry, one more thing. Where can people find more from you if they want to learn about your work?
So Food Science Babe, so I have an Instagram page and then Facebook and then Twitter, it's Food Sci Babe. And then I write an article a month for Egg Daily, so you can look on their page too for some of my articles too.